Stop, hands up. What are you doing in this neighborhood?
Walking to my house. Right there.
Your house? Dressed like that? Yeah, right. Let me guess, you stole that suit too.
You're making a $4.7 million mistake right now.
Officer Brennan thought he'd caught someone pretending to belong. A black man in an expensive suit, walking through a neighborhood where, in Brennan's mind, he didn't fit. No call, no crime, just assumptions. What Brennan didn't know, the man standing in front of him wasn't just calm, he was trained. Trained to recognize exactly what Brennan was doing. Trained to document it. Trained to dismantle it. Within 48 hours, the body cam footage would go viral. 3.2 million views. Within 6 weeks, Brennan would lose his badge, and within 3 months, the city would be staring down a $4.7 million lawsuit for racial profiling. All because one officer couldn't imagine that a black man in a suit might actually belong there. Stay with me. You need to see what happens when backup arrives and realizes who they just surrounded. Brennan's jaw tightened. $4.7 million mistake? What the hell did that mean? The body cam on his chest blinked red, recording everything. But he'd been doing this for 14 years. He wasn't backing down. Not for some guy in a suit who thought he could intimidate a police officer with legal-sounding threats. Officer Kyle Brennan, 41 years old, Phoenix Police Department, 14 years on the force, 3 formal complaints for racial profiling. All 3 complaints, all 3 ignored. The pattern was clear to anyone who bothered to look. Black professionals in upscale neighborhoods, Latino business owners near their own shops, anyone who, in Brennan's judgment, didn't fit. His supervisors called it proactive policing. Community advocates called it what it was, harassment. But Brennan never saw it that way. He believed his instincts, believed that certain people didn't belong in certain places, and when he saw something that didn't look right, he acted. That Tuesday afternoon, cruising North Phoenix, he'd been looking for exactly that, something out of place. And when he saw a black man in a navy suit walking through a neighborhood of $500,000 homes, briefcase in hand, moving with the kind of calm confidence that made Brennan's instincts flare, he pulled over. Andre Washington, 39 years old, federal employee, Phoenix. He'd just left the federal courthouse downtown, where he'd spent 3 hours testifying as an expert witness in a civil rights case. He was exhausted. The suit felt heavy. All he wanted was to go home, change, and forget about work for the night. He'd spent years teaching people how to recognize bias, how it shapes decisions, how it escalates situations that should never have started. And the moment he saw the patrol car slow down behind him, he knew exactly what was coming. Stay calm, let him show his hand, document everything. Andre had lived this before. Different cities, different officers, same script. Brennan stepped closer, hand still resting on his holster. He'd already decided to ignore whatever $4.7 million meant. Probably some lawyer trick, trying to sound important. "I don't care what you think you know," Brennan said, his voice hard. "ID, now." Andre reached into his jacket, slowly, every movement controlled, trained. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license without a word. Brennan snatched it, studied it like he was searching for a forgery. His eyes flicked between the photo and Andre's face. Then he saw the occupation line. "Federal employee?" Brennan scoffed. "Yeah, right. What do you really do?" Andre's voice stayed flat, calm. "I work in Phoenix. I live here. That's all you need to know." That answer didn't sit well with Brennan. Most people got nervous when questioned. Most people explained themselves, apologized, tried to de-escalate. This man? He was doing the opposite. Answering without offering, calm without submitting. It felt like a challenge. The body cam on Brennan's chest captured everything.
The way his hand trembled slightly when Andre didn't break eye contact. The way his jaw clenched when the calm refused to crack. For the first time in 14 years, someone was pushing back, not with anger, but with precision, and Brennan hated it. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I've got a subject with questionable identification, possible identity fraud, requesting backup." Andre's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He pulled out his phone, calm as ever. "I'm calling my supervisor now," Andre said evenly. "You should call yours." Brennan stared at him. The confidence, the lack of fear, the way he was documenting this just as thoroughly as the body cam. And that's when Brennan realized this wasn't going to be a routine stop. Andre tapped his phone and put it on speaker. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Phoenix Operations Desk? This is Washington, ID 8847. I'm being detained by local PD on my residential street. Officer claims possible identity fraud. Can you verify my status for Officer," Andre glanced at the nameplate, "Brennan, badge 7429? A pause, keys clicking in the background. "Stand by." Brennan's hand tightened on his holster. He didn't like this. Didn't like how calm this man was. Didn't like the way he spoke. Precise, controlled, like he'd done this before. Brennan keyed his radio, louder than necessary. "Dispatch, Unit 47. Subject claims federal employment. Running full background check now. I need that backup expedited." "Copy, Unit 47. Backup en route. ETA 4 minutes." A door opened across the street. Mrs. Chen stepped onto her porch. Mid-70s, cardigan, glasses. She'd lived on this block for 30 years. "Officer?" she called out, her voice steady. "That's Mr. Washington. He lives right there. 2 years now." Brennan barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, please step back. This is police business." Mrs. Chen didn't move. "I'm just telling you, he's my neighbor. Very quiet, no trouble." "Ma'am, I need you to go back inside." "I'm standing on my own property," she said firmly, "and I'm telling you, you're stopping the wrong person." Brennan's jaw clenched. "Ma'am, if you interfere with this investigation, I can cite you for obstruction." Mrs. Chen crossed her arms. "I'm not interfering, I'm witnessing." Brennan's radio crackled. "Unit 47, subject identity confirmed. Andre Washington, federal employee, Phoenix-based, address verified at 2847 North Maple. No warrants, no flags, record clean." The words hit Brennan like cold water. Andre's phone came back to life. "Officer Brennan?" The voice on speaker was calm, professional. "Mr. Washington is a verified federal employee with full credentials. Is there an issue?" Brennan stammered. "Just routine verification." "Routine?" The voice sharpened. "He's standing in front of his own home. What's routine about that?" Brennan didn't answer. Andre ended the call, pocketed his phone. His expression hadn't changed once. Brennan should have backed off, apologized, let it go. But he'd already called for backup, already put this on record, already committed. Backing down now would look weak, would look like he'd made a mistake. So he doubled down. "Federal employee or not," Brennan said, his voice hardening, "you were acting suspicious. I had reasonable cause to stop you." Andre's eyes narrowed. "Reasonable cause? I was walking to my front door. You were loitering in a residential area. My residential area. That's your claim. That's a fact. My name is on the deed, the mailbox, the mortgage. You can verify it in 30 seconds. Brennan stepped closer. "I don't appreciate your tone."
Andre's voice stayed level. "And I don't appreciate being detained on my own property for no legal reason." Another door opened. A middle-aged white man from the house next door stepped onto his porch, phone in hand, recording. "Everything okay out here?" he called. Then another, a younger black woman from across the street, also recording. "Officer, what's going on?" she asked. "That's Andre. He lives here." Brennan looked around. 3 witnesses now, all recording, all vouching for the man he'd stopped. The body cam on his chest caught it all, every word, every face, every phone pointed at him. Mrs. Chen spoke again. "Officer, you need to let this man go. He hasn't done anything wrong." Brennan's hand trembled, not from fear, from frustration, from the realization that this stop was spiraling. "Everyone step back," he ordered. "This is an active investigation." "Investigation into what?" the man with the phone asked. "Walking while black?" Brennan turned back to Andre, his face flushed. "I'm going to need you to step away from your vehicle." Andre didn't move. "I'm not near a vehicle. I'm standing on my sidewalk." "Step back." "Officer Brennan?" Andre's voice dropped, steady and cold. "You detained me without cause. You've ignored multiple witnesses. You've fabricated reasonable suspicion, and it's all being recorded. If you escalate this further, you won't just lose your badge, you'll face federal charges." Brennan's mouth opened, closed. Sirens approached in the distance. Backup was coming, and Andre stood perfectly still, waiting. 2 patrol cars pulled up within seconds of each other, sirens wailing, then cutting to silence. Sergeant Linda Torres stepped out of the first vehicle. 20 years on the force, she'd seen every kind of officer mistake, and she could smell one from a block away. Torres walked straight to Brennan. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. "What's the situation?" Brennan straightened, trying to regain composure. "Routine stop. Subject was acting suspicious in a residential area. I requested ID. He became uncooperative. Claimed to be a federal employee, but the story didn't add up." Torres glanced past him at Andre, still standing calmly on the sidewalk. 3 neighbors on their porches, all recording, Mrs. Chen with her arms crossed. Something didn't add up, but it wasn't Andre's story. "Uncooperative how?" Torres asked. "Argumentative, refused to comply with basic requests." "Did he provide ID?" Brennan hesitated. "Yes, but—" "And dispatch confirmed his identity?" "Yes, but I still had reasonable suspicion of—" "What?" Torres's voice dropped. "What crime did you observe?" Brennan's jaw tightened. "He was loitering." Torres looked at the house behind Andre, the mailbox, the driveway. Loitering in front of a residence? He didn't look like he belonged here.
And there it was, the real reason. Torres had heard that phrase too many times in her career. She turned away from Brennan and walked toward Andre. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Torres. Can you tell me what happened?" Andre's voice was calm, measured, professional. "I was walking to my front door after work. Officer Brennan stopped me without stating probable cause. He demanded ID. I provided it. He accused me of identity fraud and called for backup. My neighbor vouched for me. He told her to step back. Dispatch confirmed my identity and address. He continued the detention anyway." Torres studied him, the Navy suit, the briefcase, the complete lack of nervousness. This wasn't someone trying to talk their way out of trouble. This was someone documenting a civil rights violation in real time. "What do you do for work?" Torres asked. "I'm a federal employee, Phoenix-based." "What kind of federal work?" Andre met her eyes. "I'm an instructor. I train federal agents in tactical psychology, interview techniques, and bias recognition in law enforcement." The street went quiet. Torres's expression shifted. Not shock, recognition. She knew exactly what that meant. Behind her, Brennan's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly. No words came out. "FBI?" Torres asked. Andre nodded once. "Phoenix Field Office. I testified in federal court this afternoon. I just wanted to go home." Torres turned slowly back to Brennan. Her voice was ice. "You stopped an FBI instructor on his own street for walking to his own house. I didn't know. You didn't ask." Torres pulled the body cam from Brennan's vest. "Let's see what you did know." She pulled up the footage on her phone, scrubbing through the last 15 minutes. The other officers and neighbors watched in silence. The screen showed Brennan stepping out of his car, hand on holster, approaching Andre with immediate suspicion. "Stop right there, hands where I can see them." Torres kept watching, Brennan demanding ID, Andre complying, Mrs. Chen vouching for him. "Ma'am, if you interfere with this investigation, I can cite you for obstruction." Dispatch confirming identity, Brennan doubling down anyway. "Federal employee or not, you were acting suspicious." Torres stopped the playback, looked at Brennan. "You detained a federal employee in front of his own home after dispatch confirmed his identity, after a neighbor vouched for him, after he provided every piece of documentation you requested." "Sergeant, I had reasonable suspicion." "Based on what? His suit? His skin color?"
Brennan's hands balled into fists. "I was doing my job." "No," Torres's voice cut like steel. "You were profiling, and you did it to someone who literally teaches agents how to recognize what you just did." She handed the body cam to another officer. Then she stepped closer to Brennan. "You just gave him a perfect example of everything we're taught not to do." Brennan stood frozen. Torres stepped back. "Get in the car, now." "Sergeant, in the car." Brennan walked to the patrol vehicle, shoulders slumped, head down. The door closed with a heavy sound. Torres turned back to Andre. "Mr. Washington, I apologize. This stop was inappropriate. A formal complaint will be filed immediately." Andre pulled out his phone, opened the voice recorder, hit record. "Sergeant, I appreciate that, but I'm also contacting my attorney. This isn't just a complaint. This is a federal civil rights violation, documented, witnessed, and it's part of a pattern I intend to address through legal channels." Torres didn't argue. She nodded once. "Understood. Here's my card. Anything you need from the department, contact me directly." Andre took the card. Then he turned and walked to his front door. Mrs. Chen waved. He waved back. The neighbors returned inside. The patrol cars pulled away. And Andre finally went home, exhausted, angry, but already planning his next move. Because he knew exactly what came next. 48 hours after the stop, the body cam footage leaked. Not through official channels. Someone inside Phoenix PD, fed up with watching officers like Brennan get away with the same pattern year after year, sent it to a local news station. By noon, it was on YouTube. By evening, 3.2 million views. The comments exploded. "He literally trains FBI agents and still got profiled. This is what systemic racism looks like. Badge number 7429 needs to be fired immediately." Local news ran it on repeat. National outlets picked it up by morning. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Protests formed outside the precinct. Andre watched the footage from his living room that night, saw himself standing calm while Brennan's hand rested on his holster, heard Mrs. Chen's voice vouching for him, watched Brennan ignore every piece of evidence. He exhaled slowly, closed the laptop. "I'm tired of this," he said to no one. 20 years of teaching people how to recognize bias, and he still couldn't walk to his own front door without being treated like a suspect. Within 72 hours, the FBI Phoenix field office released a statement. Not the usual bland corporate language, something sharper. The treatment of instructor Andre Washington was unacceptable and unlawful. Our personnel deserve the same constitutional protections as any citizen. We support Mr. Washington fully and expect swift accountability from Phoenix PD. This incident will be reviewed at the federal level. That wasn't just symbolic, that was institutional pressure. Federal law enforcement publicly condemning local police doesn't happen often. When it does, cities move fast. Andre hired a civil rights attorney. Not because he needed help understanding the law, he knew it better than most lawyers, but because filing a federal lawsuit required precision and a paper trail that couldn't be ignored. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. $4.7 million in damages, racial profiling and discrimination,
unlawful detention without probable cause, emotional distress and reputational harm, violation of Fourth Amendment civil rights. Phoenix City attorneys reviewed the footage, read the complaint, calculated the jury risk. Their conclusion was immediate. This is indefensible. Settle or prepare for a trial that destroys the department's credibility. Internal Affairs opened their investigation the same week. What they found wasn't just one bad stop, it was a pattern. 7 similar stops over 3 years, all Black or Latino professionals, all in upscale neighborhoods, all questioned without cause, not a single arrest. Officer Kyle Brennan was terminated 6 weeks after the stop. The termination letter was direct and damning. Racial profiling, unlawful detention, fabrication of reasonable suspicion, conduct unbecoming an officer. Employment terminated, effective immediately.
Phoenix PD announced reforms within 8 weeks, not suggestions, requirements. Mandatory body cam review for all residential stops. Quarterly bias training conducted by Andre's FBI unit. New oversight for officers with multiple complaints. Public database tracking profiling patterns. 3 months after the stop, Andre stood in front of a room filled with Phoenix PD officers. The first reformed training session. On the screen behind him, his own body cam footage. The stop, the detention, the escalation. The room was silent, uncomfortable. Officers shifted in their seats as they watched one of their own make every mistake Andre had been teaching federal recruits to avoid. When the video ended, Andre turned to face them. This wasn't a training scenario. This was my Tuesday, coming home from work, in my own neighborhood. He paused. This is what bias looks like when you stop questioning your assumptions. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Andre knocked on Mrs. Chen's door. She opened it, surprised to see him. "Mr. Washington, is everything okay?" Andre smiled. "I just wanted to say thank you for speaking up. A lot of people see things like that and stay silent. You didn't." Mrs. Chen waved it off. "I just told the truth." "That's more than most people do," Andre said. "Your courage matters. It made a difference." She nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad you're okay, and I'm glad they're listening now." "So am I." $4.7 million. That's the cost of assumptions, the cost of profiling, the cost of ignoring a pattern until it targets someone who can't be silenced. Brennan lost his badge, his career, his future in law enforcement. And Andre? He went back to work, training the next generation, teaching them what he'd lived through, making sure it didn't happen to someone else. 6 months later, Andre Washington stood in front of a classroom filled with new FBI recruits. On the screen behind him, body cam footage played, his own stop, time-stamped, unedited. The recruits watched in silence as Officer Brennan demanded ID, as he dismissed Mrs. Chen, as he fabricated reasonable suspicion. When the video ended, Andre turned to face them. Andre's voice was steady. Bias doesn't announce itself. It hides behind procedure, behind routine checks, behind assumptions you don't even realize you're making. Your job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to recognize when your own judgment is compromised and to stop yourself before you become the problem. The room stayed silent, absorbing, learning. If this story opened your eyes, hit subscribe. Next up, a federal judge gets pulled over for driving too nice a car. The officer had no idea who he just stopped or what it would cost him. You won't believe what happens next.